Well, good morning, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Carissa Spencer. I grew up on a farm near Madilia, Minnesota, which is near Mankato. Before coming to NRCS, I was a chemical sales rep, and a lot of my work I did in Iowa. So I was a chemical sales rep for Rhone-Poulenc Agro, which was Buck Drill, Balance, Regent, some of those chemicals. And then went to work as a co-op sales agronomist for United Western Co-op, which is on the western side of Iowa, and then at New Co-op, which is in north central Iowa. And then in 2006, I came to NRCS as a district conservationist. I worked for 6 years in Martin County. And then for the past 9 years, I've been the state agronomist in St. Paul. So I just really want to thank Bruce for the invite to come speak to you today. And we're going to just look a little bit more into what my presentation is going to be, is just look a little bit more into fertilizer and cover crops and how some of our guidance with NRCS and how that comes in together. So let's see. So, whoops. Agronomy Tech Note 33, last month we talked, we looked at Agronomy Tech Note 33 for seeding recommendations. And so this month, I thought we'd look at how fertilizer is looked at in this document as well. So Agronomy Tech Note 33 was developed in 2018, and it's kind of our guidance document with NRCS. So if you do any type of cover crop, cost share, or technical assistance, this will be the document that the field office will use with you. And so in 18, we increased the species. We went from, oh gosh, probably 20 species up to now 40 some species. We looked at rates, dates, and did a lot of adjustments to that. So, and Bruce, with you share the presentation with everybody, I've got links to all these in there as well too. So if you share that with them as well, they'll have all this there. Table 1 talks about, we talked about that a lot last month, but it talks about your seeding rates, dates, and recommendations. And one thing I want to point out on that table is at the very bottom of that is all of the guidance documents that we use to make up the tech notes. So if you want to dive more into where some of this information came from, that would be all your resources that we use for that. So Midwest Cover Crop Council, there's a ARS chart out of Mandan that we use, the SARE Cover Crop Profitability book. There's a pollinator for SARE that we use. So kind of gives you an idea of where all of that came from. And then table 2 dives more into the benefits and the performance of each of the cover crops. So that's kind of your characteristics of how each of those species will do, and how to work towards your goals when you're working with cover crops. So we'll dive into that a little bit more in the presentation. So in agronomy, so part of that is there's 18 pages of kind of guidance, and on page 7 there we talk about fertilization in there and more of the fertilizer aspect of it. So here it talks about cover crops don't necessarily need any fertilizers for them, but you may want to use fertilizer if you're trying to increase your biomass for grazing. You can use cover crops to try and trap or sequester nutrients and manure into the next crop. It also talks about looking at University of Minnesota for nitrogen credits for cover crops as well. Some of those are here, some of them haven't been researched as well. So, but one thing I wanted to look at is where we got the red arrow on the slide is highlight this section. Manure can be applied and incorporated. We suggest that you follow the best management practices or the BMPs for your area. there's a portion on here that we talk about any soil disturbance for nutrient applications, be it commercial fertilizer or manure, shall disturb no more than 1/4 of the row width. And so that's where the field offices will be working with you on that. So if you're in 20-inch rows, we're talking about 5 inches of disturbance. If you're on 22-inch rows, we're looking at 6 inches. 30-inch rows, 8 inches. So you really want to look at some of your equipment and see, you know, what that disturbance really is. And the main reason is we don't want to limit your ability to put on manure or fertilizer, but we also want to protect that investment that we have with the cost share with cover crops. We don't want it to be all torn out with putting manure or fertilizer on if it's established. So that's kind of some of those parameters that are set in there. And then to get back to table 2, if you're looking for go in a little bit more depth, I kind of showed the headers that we've got here and some of the ratings. So where we've got the red arrows would be some of the places you might want to look at: your nutrient source, your total nitrogen, pounds per acre, your cover crops that would be more nitrogen scavenging, cover crops that might handle low fertilizer tolerance, and then excuse me, your CNN ratios. So your ratings will go from 0 being poor up to 4 being excellent. So kind of helps you try to develop some good mixtures that help with the goals of your farming practices. So carbon and nitrogen ratios, I want to talk a little bit more about this and just kind of get you thinking about this. Ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio, or CDN ratio, is 24:1. They call that the ideal microbial diet. How is that determined? Is microbes are average an 8:1 carbon ratio. So in order to stay alive, they need their body maintenance plus energy. So you've got 16 parts of carbon that the microbes will use for energy, and 8 parts that they'll use for their body maintenance. So that's how they come up with the 24:1. So when we're thinking about soil health and trying to how is it, you know, residue is going to break down, how are we going to get the soil more active, that's when we're looking at, you know, this underground microbes and trying to get them enough carbon and nitrogen ratio to maintain their microbial diet of that 24:1. So what you'll start to see is when we talk about if you have things that are greater than 24:1, you're going to have a temporary nitrogen deficit called immobilization. And then if you remember that as part of the nitrogen cycle, that's kind of how this will come into play. But when you're less than 24:1, you have a temporary nitrogen surplus, or otherwise called mineralization. So we're always kind of trying to find that balance. So you might have heard, or you might, you know, the lower the carbon nitrogen ratio, the more it's going to be, the more it's going to decompose. So on this table 1 that they have here, the hairy vetch, excuse me, cover crop is 11:1. It would decompose fairly quickly and leave the field bare and prone to wind or water erosion. So you don't want to plant a cover crop completely to some of those low carbon and nitrogen ratios, because that could happen. But you don't want to have a field with a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, such as your cereal grains or your corn stalks, because it takes so much more to overcome that carbon and nitrogen ratio. So the longer you leave the cover crop out there, the higher the carbon to nitrogen ratio will be there as well too. So I wanted to kind of highlight that on this table. It talks about that as well too. So you've got your rye cover crop is a vegetative 26:1, but as the longer you leave that, excuse me, leave that rye cover crop out there, you get a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. So your cover crop is the rye cover crop as it goes from the vegetative phase to the flowering stage is a 37:1. And then when you get to the rye straw, if you leave it out there for the whole entire season, then you get to an 82:1. So you can kind of see the progression of the carbon to nitrogen ratios. So there's more. This, what I show on the screen is NRCS handout that we have with this, but there's more and more research every year coming on more of these carbon to nitrogen ratios from different universities. So it's something to think about as you put together your cover crop mixtures and how that all comes into play and speeds up those things. So the next thing I wanted to look at was we have several laws here in Minnesota when it comes to nutrient management that I just wanted you to be aware of. So if you have manure on your farms, you're looking at, MPCA or the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, their 70-20 rules. So that is the animal feedlot rules. Cover crops are a part of this rule, and they're being able to apply manure into a growing cover crop in June, July, and August. That is written into those rules in there. And then they're also going through trying to change some of those rules to allow for cover crops later in the season as well. And then MDA, or the Minnesota Department of Ag, has the fertilizer rule, or what is now known as the groundwater protection rule. And that gets more into the commercial fertilizer portion of that, and drinking water areas and those types of things. So those would be rules to be made aware of. And then University of Minnesota has its nutrient guidelines, and I've provided 2 links here. The first one is the crop specific, and if you haven't been on there recently, the corn and soybean recommendations did change in 2020. So Dan Kaiser changed the nitrogen recommendations along with the potassium recommendations. So you might want to become familiar with some of those. And then the manure recommendations also changed in 2020. Melissa Wilson from the University of Minnesota has been redoing those. So there's links to these places as well. And this would be the University of Minnesota guidelines would also show those legume credits that I talked about earlier as well. And then the next slide is, I just wanted to highlight a few studies that are happening that were recently done in northern Minnesota, or recently or continuing. Some of them have just started. So Melissa Wilson has a national conservation innovation grant. So that's actual, they call it a CIG grant from NRCS on the national level. So she's looking at injecting manure into cover crops, and the research is being done in Morris, Minnesota, and Waseca. So, so I think that's kind of exciting to see, something in that northern area and see how it looks. But she's looking at three different corn on corn, continuous silage, and soybeans followed by corn. So you can kind of see some of those progressions. And then Fabian Fernandez is looking at cover crop potential to reduce nitrate leaching. And he's got 2 different cover crop systems. It's a winter rye and then a continuous living mulch of Kira clover. And they're looking at that at the research farm in Westport, along with Polk County SWCD. So those would be kind of 2 studies that are recent that you might want to look at as well. And then Anna Cates is She is from the Minnesota Office of Soil Health. On her website, she has got all of the active cover crop research that is there on a Google Doc, and it also includes the links there to take you right to some of those research areas as well. So those would be some studies that are fairly recent that you might want to look at. And then the last slide I wanted to touch on was, if you ever want to look at any type of research or doing anything with on your own farm, you want to see what how things are doing. NRCS does have in our EQUIP program, or our Environmental Qualities Incentives program, we do have an adaptive management practice, and those will be in nutrient management 590, cover crops 340, and in residue management no-till 329. And basically it is, you're doing on-farm research on your farm. So you have to ask a question, cover crop versus non-cover crop, manure versus manure with or without in a cover crop, those types of things you might want to look at. But it has to be replicated plots, 3 to 4 replications out there. You have to have statistical analysis. And so that's where we really suggest working with the university or somebody that can do that statistical analysis. And then we have guidance documents for each of those. So Agronomy Tech Note, National Agronomy Tech Note 7 is for the adaptive nutrient management process. And then Agronomy Tech Note 10 is where the cover crops and the no-till, that's their individual tech note for those. So, but kind of show you the payments that were on there, what we paid for fiscal year for this year, for fiscal year 20 and 21. So just gives you an idea, but of what you could do if you want to look into more research on your own farm. And with that, I'm done. Sorry about the coughing there, but I came down with COVID in the beginning of March, so just trying to get through some of that. So, but if you have any questions, feel free to email or call me. But I appreciate Bruce having me speak today. So.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think there's a lot of good information there for both the producer and the agronomists that are joining us today. So anyone have any questions for Carissa on that information or anything? Not at this time.
I guess I have a question, Carissa.
Go ahead, Randy.
You talked about the carbon nitrogen ratio of certain cover crops. So if a farmer is dealing with a contract with someone for carbon sequestering, you would want the higher carbon to nitrogen ratio practices for those people?
That's a good question. It's all about getting that system, to work. And so I think you want, the higher your carbon and nitrogen ratio is it's going to be harder to those microbes to do their work. So I think you still want to stay around that 24, that 24 to 1 if you can, just to allow that process to speed up. So as some of the producers have been doing this for a while, they see that residue, filter through a lot faster as the microbes become more and more active. So that's probably something more to look at that portion of it versus the carbon sequestration of it. So I think having that balance of cereal rye and like hairy vetch or radish, having those legumes and the grasses kind of all together, those mixtures, it plays a better part. So
okay. All right, this carbon contract thing confuses the dickens out of me, so I'm learning.
I have all sorts
of questions
too.
on that thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm learning too, trying to, and all the different platforms and everything else too. So yeah, yep. So hopefully we know more in the next year or two on that. But yeah, it's changing every day on those things.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? And I have a few later, but if there's no more questions for Carissa right now, we will probably move on to Brian Bigler, and I will have him kind of introduce himself and kind of his farming operation. And if we have any questions for him, you want to take questions as you go, Brian, or at the end?
It doesn't matter. We can go as we go along. It's just fine. So that's,
okay.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Bigler. I'm down southwest corner of the state here by Lake Wilson. For about 10 years now, I've been started with strip tilling, and about a year later, I started doing start working cover crops in and on the system, and also doing no tilling. So been trying a little bit of everything, and every year seems like I trying to make a little different tweaks to the system a little bit. Been having good luck with the cover crops. They've still every year it seems like it's a little bit of a learning game with them on the proper way and timing and everything on when to get them applied, and establishments, and definitely the different cover crops, also different species for what you're looking at doing. The strip tilling has worked really well for me. Been very happy with that. That's one thing I'm definitely not going to give up. Really been happy with my yields and just how everything's turning. Chris was talking about the carbon nitrogen ratio there, and that's one thing I've definitely seen picked up now. I mean, I can have ryegrass just starting heading out and get it terminated and stuff. And I mean, I can go out there in the middle of summer and I got hardly anything left on the fields anymore. So things are really starting to break down really fast for me now. So, and that's with the corn stalks. And I plant everything green for soybeans now as much as I possibly can. The only time I don't, well, I guess I won't say there's any time that I don't. Actually, my preference is to plant soybeans in green nowadays. It just plants so much nicer. The soil so much more mellow, and I don't know, it just plants fantastic. It's definitely a nerving thing the first time you do it to pull out there, and usually you're so used to planting just into a completely black soil and not having anything there, and then you got all your no-till residue sitting there, and you got your rye and whatever cover's growing. So, but I've definitely liked that. The weed control out of it's just been fantastic. Really knocks the weeds down on, or helps hold the weeds back. Been seeding most of my covers. I got a Hagee that I got a seed box on it that I've been typically going in August. Last half of August, first half September. And that all depends on just kind of sunlight that's getting through the crop, or through the corn canopy. Beans usually start seeding then right about just before leaf drop, kind of started getting a halfway decent yield to the beans, start going in and seeding that in there. And then all my strip tilling's done. I try to do that all in the fall if I can, but last couple of years with kind of the screwed up falls we've been having, have been having to do some acres in the spring, which has been working out just fine too. So I don't know, I guess kind of a little quick rundown of what I've been doing. If anybody's got any questions, you can fire away.
Yeah, I got a question. I read contradicting information on planting alfalfa into rye stubble green. Some people say it's a no-no, and some people say it works out just fine. Do you have any experience with that?
With alfalfa into rye?
Yes.
No, I haven't done any of that. It's
Okay.
I just got all row crops. I don't have any alfalfa. So
Does anybody else have any? I don't know what to. I read it both ways, and I don't know what to do. To be honest with you.
I guess the biggest thing I would maybe have a little bit of caution with it is that, I mean, that allelopathic effect from the rye, you'd probably be okay as long as you plant or terminate the rye plenty early and give it at least a couple weeks beforehand, and maybe even a little bit longer. But I definitely, if you are going to try it, definitely want to have that terminated as early as possible.
Okay.
Brian, did you put a basically a dry box on your Hagee, or was that already on there?
No, I purchased box. I take the tank off, solution tank off, and then mount a box on top in the place of that. And then I run hoses down the boom and drops every 30 inches down in between the rows.
Okay, so you have separate hoses.
Yeah, it's the one I've had two different ones. My first one I had did 80 feet. Now when I had the box, the candy box, now I put splitters on it. So I split one hose for every 2 rows. Now this new system I got, it'll do 120 feet, and it blows it out to towers, basically like on an air seeder. Blows it out to towers and then distributes it out from those towers out to each row.
Okay.
So I think each tower typically is either 4 to 5 rows out of each tower.
So you're thinking the advantage with that over an airplane, A, you can do it yourself, and B, you're getting that seed down closer to the ground?
Yeah, you're getting it all down into the ground. You, depending on how long your drop tubes are, I think my drop tubes are 36-inch long drop tubes. So I get it down into that canopy a long ways, so you don't get anything tied up into that whirl or up in those flag leaves or anything like that.
What stage of corn do you shoot for with that Hagee?
That is at about the middle of August, 1st of September. You got to go out. One thing I've noticed is you want to do daylight, that sunlight that you're getting down into the crop canopy. In 2015, I was out there about right around the 15th of August, and I got it seeded. Tonight I had 2.5 inches of rain. 4 days later, I went out and checked it, and I had growth coming up. I'm like, great, this is fantastic, just the way it's supposed to go. 2 weeks later, I walked out there and everything was dying off. And all I could think, there was no sunlight. We had such a dense canopy that year, and it got no sunlight into it, and it just died out. It was like, I mean, it's like any other crop. It needs sunlight and heat units to keep it growing. So usually now I go out and just walk into the field and crouch down in there. And if you can get 50% for sure of sunlight hitting on the ground, then I'll definitely get going on it. Get started seeding.
So you're putting most of your fertilizer down. How are you doing your fertilizer with your rotation then? You're putting down everything for your corn the fall before with your strip till, doing nothing with soybeans?
Yeah, all my P and K goes down in the strip for the corn. I just fertilize for the corn crop, all P and K, and then I side dress and high dress after planting. This year I'm going to try putting some 28% down. I'm going to run a strip freshener across the strips first before I plant. I'm going to dump in 10 gallons of 28% in the strip just to give me a little bit more in up front. And then I usually just broadcast my P and K in front of the beans, the 30-30 or 40-40. Put a little P and K out in front of it. And one reason I do that is just like keep that whole soil profile built a little bit more. With the strip till, I'm bouncing back and forth about 8 inches between the rows. So I'll plant, make that one strip, and then the next year, or with the corn, and then I'll just jump over 8 rows and no-till the beans back in, and then that strip goes back on top of that bean row. So I'm only getting that fertilizer in those 8 inches, those 2 strips 8 inches apart. So I just feel with the broadcast, it kind of keeps that whole soil profile built up a little bit.
So I do have a question. Corey Walker couldn't make it today, and he did send a question. Is there any research, and maybe this is kind of for Carissa too, and Brian, is there any research you guys know of broadcasting fertilizer in a growing cover crop in the spring to limit the amount of loss of volatilization? Are you guys finding there isn't much volatilization with that? Are you putting an inhibitor on there so you don't have any, or?
I guess I don't use any inhibitor. Like I said, with my nitrogen, that's all on in season pretty much. So I mean, the crop's using it up pretty quick. So I guess I haven't seen much change with that. Chris, if you guys have seen anything.
No, that's what, yeah, I'm thinking that would be the same thing too. So you shouldn't need an inhibitor. You know, if you've got a growing cover crop, biggest thing would be burn, you know, it's, you know, especially if you're putting it on nitrogen onto a growing crop, would just be the burn of it. So initially, but most of the time that'll overcome it itself. So.
And I'm assuming he's somewhat thinking too, just broadcasting your P and K, you know, and I kind of had this question too, you know what, some of them are kind of immobile macronutrients. How are they getting down so that that plant can uptake it by just spreading it on top? You know, your phosphorus isn't going to move much. Potassium might move some. Your nitrogen is going to be mobile. That's going to go down. But how are you? Have you seen any problems, Brian, with having a lack of phosphorus by just spraying it on top? And how is it getting in the ground? Is it microbes going up and bringing it down into the soil, or how is it getting in there?
Yeah, I guess I haven't seen any issues. I know Fabian, he did some studies on it. You know, he had basically most of the nutrients from plants were taken up in that top 2 inches of the soil. Anyway, he had done a while ago. I know he's doing, him and Kaiser and them, they're doing some more work on that, it sounds like, but oh, excuse me. But yeah, I guess haven't had any issues with that. I think that stuff's still getting in there, moving around or is readily available. And then I think just that time, there's so much phosphorus, especially in the soil already, that's just, you know, keeps releasing all the time. That you never have that first year that's everything's going to be available anyways. So
I'm not familiar with the Lake. I'm not familiar with the Lake Wilson area. Is that a high phosphorus, low potash area, or the other way around?
No, well, it probably about like everybody, it varies quite a bit. We got some spots in the fields you go, it's kind of a wash either way. Some spots you get in the fields, you're really high on phosphorus. Next spot you're going to be higher on the potassium. So it's pretty variable soil around here on everything.
Probably a better question to ask is, do you have lots of calcium and magnesium in your soils, or is it pretty low?
Calcium's not too bad. Mag's a little bit higher. Okay. Maybe a little bit higher.
Okay.
Do you have small grain at all in your rotation?
I've done some. I did some oats here the other year. Now, last fall when I was seeding my covers, I had 40 acres of it. I cranked my cereal rye up pretty heavy, up to about 100 pounds with my Hagee system, and I'm hoping if that comes through thick enough, I'm going to harvest that this summer. Then I can use that as my own cover. So what I've seen so far looks like it's starting to green up pretty good. I haven't been up there for about a week and a half now, but everything's starting to green. It looked pretty good then, but things are greening up, so I got to get up there and look at it again once.
Were you taking that? You put that on after you harvested, or I'm assuming?
No, I was put that on in August with my Hagee. Okay. It was probably, I think it was the 20th, 25th or something like that. I seeded it of August.
So you're putting everything on August-ish.
Yeah. Okay. That's the rye seems fine up till I think you can get a chance of getting rye okay into that beginning of October maybe, but anything else after, I mean, I'm even September on with all the clovers and turfs and radishes and stuff, I unless you got an ideal fall conditions, hopefully I don't say anything bad, Carissa, but I just feel it's also a waste of money on it, to be honest with you. You go out there and you get I know there's some roots growing, you get a little bit of different root growing in there, but what you're actually getting out of it, I don't know if it's, I mean, turnips and radish and stuff, they're not cheap. You know, they're what, $1.60, $2.50, $3 a pound for them things. So they start adding up pretty good in price. So, you know, it still comes down to your economics. What's value are you actually getting out of that dollar you're spending out there? And for those, I just don't see that. I mean, like clover, you're never going to get any nodulation out of that plant in that season. The only time you see clover doing it is if you're going early season, like seeing it maybe in that V4, V5 in the corn, then you might get some out of it, or maybe if you're doing it after a silage. But other than that, if you're getting into that September timeframe, especially on them, it just doesn't seem like you get a lot of benefit out of them.
Have you experienced putting anything in your corn at V4 to 6 somewhere there?
I did. Oh, I did a few years ago, and I've just the way the years have gone, I haven't gotten back to it. But this year, I'm going to make a more effort in getting back into that earlier season. One thing I've been noticing with annual rye doesn't. If you're doing it that early, you're going to want to use an annual rye. You don't want to use cereal rye because cereal rye won't make it through. But the annual rye is not nearly as winter hardy as cereal rye is. But with especially going into the corn stalks, I mean, with no-till, my fields, first snow, the snow all stays right there in the field. It doesn't blow off. So once you get that cover on that annual ryegrass, then that stuff makes it through the winter pretty easy then. So then you can just rely on that annual rye to come through then.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Robbie, I know you've got some no-till stuff going on, and you just have small grain. How are you just applying everything on top also for your fertilizer?
That's what we did last year for the wheat. We used the turbo tiller, whatever, out there, you know, for part of that.
Mm-hmm. Did you see any difference between what we used the Turbo Max on and what you just seeded without any tillage?
I couldn't see much difference last year. I would imagine in that ground, it's going to depend on, you know, moisture, what we're getting for rain and stuff like that.
I guess just to kind of let the rest of you know, we're basically he's got an extremely light field, and we basically cut it in half. We're using no-till with cover crops on half of it. We're using just minimum tillage with a Turbo Max, and cover crops on the other half with a strip in the middle with nothing, no cover crops. And I think we're on our second year. This will be the third year.
I think this will be my fourth. I was going a year before I started with you. So yeah, be my third for sure on it. And I've noticed the soil difference already it's coming along. It's going to take a while, but yeah, it's changed.
How long have you been doing that, you said?
I think this will be my fourth year coming up here now. I've had 3 full cover crops in there.
Yeah, you'll start seeing some changes. And it seems like after year 3, things start really kind of picking up after 3. Definitely see changes then.
Brian, are you looking at lowering your fertilizer that you put on the field now that you've been doing this for 10 years at all, or not yet?
We do a little bit. We're going to start working on trying to bring them down some more, running some strips out there and seeing if we can start bringing it down some more. You know, I've had I've had every once in a while I get a glitch in my system on my strip till bar on my egg leader system, and then all of a sudden it'll just shut off quick. It'll do like about as fast as you can turn the switch on and off on the machine, and you can pick those spots out in the field just driving down the road. They're about 2 feet shorter, and I mean you come through with the combine, you can definitely pick those spots out in a hurry too. So I mean, you know, a lot of them guys you can run 60% of what your normal rates are, but we've been dropping them down. But you know, crop still needs its nutrients to still produce a bushel of grain, what it is. So you can probably, I'm working on it anyway. Long story short.
And that's kind of what my thought is, or my suggestion to the people that are starting, you know, is keep your fertilizer recommendations at, you know, at what you have been doing. A lot of the hype and everything comes of you can lower your fertilizer and you can do, you know, get rid of some of your pesticides and some of that, but you just keep it status quo, because it's going to take a while, like Robbie talked about too. It's going to take a while for that system to get up and going. So
I grid sample all my fields, so we're on some different ones that were coming in second and third cycles on them. And I mean, we're not on a build mode. We've always been on a maintain level, and we have been maintaining the fertility levels out in the fields. They aren't really going up or down. They're just staying pretty flat. So we've been pretty happy with at that. Some they've gone down just a touch once in a while, so we'll bump the rates just a little bit on them. But for the most part, we've just been maintaining everything as we've been going through these last years. So been hitting it pretty close on that side. Biggest thing is with a lot of it is on a good year, good growing season, with all these practices, I'm not going to say you're going to see a lot of benefits. It's the crappy years is where things are going to shine. In, let's see, 18, we've had 2 fall, let's see, 17 and 18, we had 2 really wet falls. And everybody was out leaving tracks all over the place and getting their combine stuck and everything. And if you want to stop, get somebody to change their conversation with you fast, is when they come up and ask you, like, yeah, how many times you gotten stuck yet? And you say none. And you know they've been out there with their tractors dragging themselves out and making messes all over. They change the conversation pretty fast. And then in 19, my corn yield, I beat our county average by over 20, 30 bushel on our corn average. And I know I had fields that were doing over 200, and neighbors were barely pushing 120 on some of their fields. There's just kind of a really wet crap, just a wet abnormal year for us. And so those years, it's adverse conditions is when it really starts to shine.
This may sound like a dumb question, but you put headlands in your fields, or do you go straight into a
Headlands?
You do use headlands, so.
Yeah.
There was a guy talking about just skipping the headlands and leaving it go because he loses money on his headlands anyway, and then just going straight into the field. And I'm thinking that's kind of different. I didn't know if I could support that or what, but
I've seen some other people do that too, and I've kind of heard that analogy to it too, but I don't know. I guess the only reason I lose money on my headlands is if I'm running through with the Hagee too many times during the year and I run down too much corn. But otherwise, I really don't see that much difference in the headlands. And I don't run a ripper or anything through my headlands. It's they get nothing done on them besides pulling the strips in the fall for the corn and the beans. At the most, I'll maybe run my vertical till across just to level things off a little bit, but otherwise I don't do anything different to my headlands than what I do with the rest of the fields.
On a normal year, you make your strips in the fall. When you come back in the spring, do you ever have to freshen up those strips, or can you plant right in?
Typically, I plant directly into them. This spring, I'm going to do some more freshening with them. One thing I know, last year was my first year that I really did a bunch of spring strips because we didn't get that many. We got with the wet fall in 19. I noticed my planter ride and my spacing was quite a bit better. It was pretty easy to jump up to that 99% singulation. And when you're not, I mean, it's the strip's a little bit rougher, so you get more bounce out of it. So sometimes you'll run 95, 96, sometimes you'll get up in the higher rates, but I'm going to try out the strips and just see if I notice much difference between the planting on it that way. It's a lot easier if you don't have to.
So Brian, if you don't mind me asking, approximately how many acres? Because I've had some of my producers say, Bruce, I've got to be able to do this on 5,000 acres, not on 500. Is it something that's doable for a large farmer to be able to get across all of this and do all the processes you need to do?
Oh yeah. If you're set up, I got 2,500 corn soybeans. I got 2,500 acres of mine. So we do 1,200 acres of strip of my own in the fall, and we'll push. And this is a 12-row strip till bar and front wheel assist tractor, and we'll do over 2,000 custom acres in the fall too. So we can easily do over 3,000 acres of strips in the fall, and no tilling beans. If it's halfway decent spring, you just hook, everybody else is running out the field with their field cultivator or digger or whatever you want to call it. You're heading out the field with the planter and just drop it in and go. So we run, let's see, in the spring, we do about we'll plant about 3,500, 4,000 acres of crop in and stuff. And it's just the planter and tractor and the sprayer. And that's basically all we have going in the spring. So it's pretty easy to cover acres.
Do 30-inch rows?
Yes.
30?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's good to know. Well, our next presenter is not here yet. So if you have more questions for Brian or for Carissa, ask away. And
I got a question for Brian, if you got it. Did you just jump into this, or did you slowly work your way in? And also with that, what did the banker think of you doing that?
My first strip tilling, I had a neighbor of mine, or a friend of my dad's. He had strip tilled for like 20 some years. I had him do 60 acres for me. The next year I bought my own rig and went all in on the strip till. I was pretty much sold on that. The no tilling, I kind of kept working that up more. I bought a vertical till. I got the strip till bar and the vertical till all in the same year. And I thought I was going to just go out and hit the corn stalks in the fall with the VT and be done with it. And that lasted 1 or 2 years. And main reason why I slowed up on that was makes the field look really nice in the fall. It's all nice and smooth and everything else until you get a 40-mile-an-hour wind and all your crop residues in the neighbors' road ditches or fence lines or yards, and you get some unhappy neighbors with you when you do that. So, if I do any VTing on corn stalks, it's just in the spring, if I need to. But the covers and the no-till, and that was a little bit worked that more in, but now I'm pretty much all in on everything.
Yeah.
Banker, they had questions, but after I took the numbers into them and showed them the reduction in machinery costs that I could get, and granted, you got that uptime that front costs. It depends on it. Buying a strip till bars that are not cheap machines. You're going to be, especially if you're looking at new, you're going to be easily 100 to 200,000, depending on what you're looking at. If you're not trading anything in, if you're buying that all right out, which I did at first, So my dad was pretty skeptical about everything, so we had to keep the ripper and everything else around. But luckily, when I did it, crop prices and everything were coming up and on the upswing, and it was drier too, so a little easier to implement everything. But the banker, after I explained everything to him, and he actually wanted me to go talk to some other people too and just kind of explain things on them, and they're all behind me on it afterwards.
What I find with bankers is that first 2-3 years it takes to get the soil conditioned and maybe a little less yields and stuff, they get really nervous.
Yeah, they do. The only time I ever took a yield hit was, let's see, on one of my cornfields, I didn't get strips. It was the first year I was doing strips, and I didn't get the strips made, and I had to hit it with the vertical till in the spring, and I just had too much residue on there for the corn at that time, and I wasn't quite positive what I was doing on it. So that was about the only time I took a little bit of hit on yield. Otherwise, my yields haven't taken anything yet.
Good. Good.
Is there anything else, Brian, as a newcomer to cover crops or no-till or strip-till that you would advise them not to do? That one big mistake that, other than, maybe that vertical till, would there be anything else that you would push them not to do that you found has been detrimental to it?
I guess the biggest thing I would say not to do is not be afraid to ask questions and talk to somebody else who's done it. I spent a lot of time before I jumped in this. I probably looked at it for about 5 years, talking to different people and going to different conferences all over the Midwest here and things. And if you're gonna be strip tilling, it's a lot easier with having RTK, having a good agronomist and stuff to set up your prescriptions. You're gonna be, I do run prescriptions on a lot of mine. So having a good agronomist, somebody to work with on that, and just taking the time to set up. If you're the type of guy that wants to just jump in a piece of machinery and go, you're going to have a lot of issues. I had a neighbor of ours that he's one of those guys that he's a good farmer, don't get me wrong, but he just wants to drop the piece of machinery in the field and get going and just go. Doesn't want to take the time to make a setting. So you got to be able to, especially strip tilling, you want to be able to take your time, ride alongside the machine with a 4-wheeler or something, and just see how the strips are building. And you just got definitely a different management style to things.
Jim, do you have any questions about strip till? I know our last meeting you were kind of, thinking about getting into the strip till. Do you have any particular questions about strip tilling?
Well, the biggest thing that I'm curious about strip tilling is putting rye down on my soybeans in August, like you talked about, and then potentially coming in with corn in the spring and doing strip tilling in the spring and getting that fertilizer down in the strip. And I just heard concerns about if you don't kill the rye soon enough, you could have insect crossover issues. And just stuff like that. So it's just, I hear one thing here and I hear another thing over there, and it's just not sure how the best way to work that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. You definitely, excuse me. I don't think this says don't want this to scare anybody off, but the first year that I did strips in the fall into cover crops, and that next spring I went in there and planted it, and I did take a yield hit, probably about 5 to 7 bushel that year. You can see a visual difference in the corn. It's every person you ask about this is going to be different. Some will say that it's allelopathic effect. Others will say it's a nutrient deficiency on it. My personal thought, and from what I saw that year, I think it was a little bit of the allopathic. And I was out there, we lucked out that spring. I was able to get out there beginning of April and get that rye sprayed off. And so it was dead when I planted. But then I was probably 10 days, at least 10 days ahead of planting. But I think it was more just nutrient tie up with that cover had so much, taken up so much nutrients, it was just tie up in it. And once it really, middle of summer, that crop, it started taking off again, but you know, it already was held back a little bit through all your ear set and everything else on the plants, on the corn. So that's one reason why I'm going to put a little bit of nitrogen up front. Guys that I've talked to that have been very successful with it, it seems like a lot of them are putting some little bit of nitrogen up front just to give it that little kick right in the beginning to get it stage it through there. So that would be probably my biggest recommendation to do, is just getting a little bit of nitrogen right up front with it.
That was my thought too, Brian, because I tried to find research on it too, because I couldn't. I was trying to find it for this presentation too,
Yeah.
Jim, but we've got the allopathic effect, you know, that plays into it too. But then there is talk that, you know, maybe putting in, you know, that 10 gallon or, you know, something in ahead of it for nutrients value would help too. So just, there's not much research out there to help through that part yet. So
There's quite a few farmers I know that are doing it, that are doing it and stuff. And is that the ones that seems like the ones that I've talked to have been most successful on it are putting some liquid up front with them just to give it that kick and give it that bridge into the next stage. But like Chris was saying, you got that carbon and nitrogen right there, and so it takes a while for that to get broke down. So if you got that something up front there to give it that bridge, then you should be fine. Not saying I'm not guaranteeing that. I had the one best advice I got out of when I first started looking into all this. The best piece of advice I got from somebody is some older guy I was talking to, and he said, the best thing I can tell you is if you talk to somebody and they tell you that they know everything about this, they don't know shit. And so I've always remembered that one. So it's just kind of, and what works for me, I'm not going to say ever tell somebody this is what's going to work for you. It's just kind of giving you a guide. You can take some of them things out. I mean, if it's a pitfall that's worked for me, I'll definitely say don't do this. But what I've done, I know where you guys are at. I mean, just from one side of the county to the other side can be quite a bit different. And, so when I talk about stuff, it's just all kind of a guide, you know, things that you can possibly try or look at or something like that, and help you hopefully avoid the big pitfalls on it. So big pitfalls really turns a person off in a hurry. So.
And we hope we don't have them in the first year or two.
Definitely. It's a lot easier to come up after a few years.
Ryan, are you a member of the Soil Health Coalition?
Yes.
Okay, so a guy can find your name and number on there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a mentor on that one.
Okay, sounds
You're
good.
also on the corn growers too, or Brian?
Yeah, I'm vice president right now of the state corn growers.
Good. And I don't want to you guys keep thinking of questions for Brian and for Carissa. I see Paul Hetland, our other presenter, is on the call now. So I think we're going to move on to Brian, to Paul. And Paul, if you just want to introduce yourself and kind of your operation and you know, some of the things that we talked about on the phone, that'd be wonderful. Pretty informal here.
Sorry for being late. I'll apologize if I duplicate anything that was covered already. My name is Paul Hetland. I farm near Mitchell, South Dakota, which is about an hour west of Sioux Falls on I-90. I'm in kind of the heart of the prairie pothole region. So gives you a little idea where my farm is. I left the farm after college for about 10 years, came back to my family farm in the late 90s. to some changes. Things were changing pretty rapidly with the introduction of soybeans to our area. A lot of crop rotations had gone from what I grew up with, which is corn, oats, barley, things of that nature, to primarily a corn soybean rotation. When I came back to the farm, and as we started to look at some long-term goals and objectives, sustainability, we felt like that probably wasn't the best plan for us moving forward. So we were looking for ways to intensify our rotations. We decided to introduce wheat to our rotations, just to bring in another grass crop. As we looked for more solutions and tools, ways to give ourselves some diversification, we added a couple of hog confinement barns to give ourselves access to some fertility, things of that nature. And probably in the 2006 or 2007 timeframe, we were introduced to the concepts of planting a cover crop behind our wheat in our rotations. We started doing some research on cover crops, what they could do for us. And no one really knew much about them at that time. So we planted our first cover crop. I want to say it was about 80 acres behind one of our wheat fields, and we planted turnips and radishes. Very simple blend, easy to establish, pretty high success rate. Was a good visual, and off we went. Now I'll say we planted that first cover crop out behind the trees. I think I was sharing with Bruce, I didn't want to deal with questions over it. I didn't want neighbors asking what we were doing. It was very much viewed as snake oil, or just an activity that was not proven. So through time and through different successes and failures, as we started to identify objectives for our cover crops, we started to learn that there were a lot of blends that we could put together to accomplish many different things. In our part of the world, we don't have a lot of topsoil. And so our primary objective as no-tillers was just to protect that soil. We're worried about wind erosion. We're worried about water erosion. We just wanted something that would help us protect that soil, keep it in place, because it's a scarce commodity to start with. Over and above that, we started to say, okay, let's see what we can do to build soil health. You know, one of the reasons that we're not doing tillage is because we're trying to improve the tilth of our soil, the organic matter levels in our soil. We don't have a lot of topsoil, and then right beneath that topsoil, we have a heavy yellow clay. So our soils are very susceptible to compaction from traffic and tillage and things like that. So we said, can we do something with the cover crop that will help us alleviate compaction, improve water infiltration? And then we started to look at the soil in general and said, okay, after wheat, you know, we've got this long break of up to 10 months where there's maybe nothing growing before we plant our next corn crop. And we used to think that that was a good thing because it gave us a fallow period to build moisture levels. But the more we got to understand the microbiology and the soil life, we understood that they needed a living root to be able to interact with. And so we said, okay, we can use this cover crop to continue that cycle. And we almost think of a cover crop as harvesting sunlight, right? We're just taking that energy from the sun, using that cover crop to sequester carbon and build our soil. And so we're finding out that we can do all of these things with a cover crop. And so I'll kind of jump ahead to where we're at today. and tell you what plan A is for our cover crops in our systems is our rotation now is primarily a 3-crop rotation. We'll plant corn. We'll follow that with soybeans. We'll no-till those soybeans into that standing corn residue. And then as soon as the soybeans are harvested, we'll no-till wheat into that soybean residue. In late July or early August, as soon as we harvest that wheat, we will chase the combine with our air seeder and we will plant our cover crops. I want to say that our blend last year was a mix of turnips, radish, oats, flax, barley, field peas, and crimson clover. And then we always have a stand of volunteer wheat that comes back that we just consider part of that cover as well. We try and establish that as soon as we can in the growing season, just to give it time to mature and produce some biomass for us and things of that nature. And then on specific pieces of land that are close in proximity to our confinement barns, we will come out typically after Labor Day. Our state fair in South Dakota is over Labor Day weekend. So typically after that weekend, I'll come out and I'll pump each of our 2,400 head confinement barns, and I will go into those standing cover crops and I will inject manure application into a band in 30-inch row spacing. So essentially I'm strip tilling for our next year corn crop. And if we can do that successfully and catch any rain at all on those fields, it's just a tremendous setup for that following year corn crop. We have found that we're just able to really do some good things. You know, when we first built the hog barns, I had a lot of people tell me that you should not apply those nutrients in the fall when the soil is warm. That really, in terms of timing for the next year crop, the following spring is the best time to do that. But that just really doesn't work with our workload, time management. And so with that standing cover crop there already growing, we see just a tremendous surge in growth and production of biomass. I'm not worried about losing that free nitrogen now. We're recycling those nutrients right into the cover crop, but yet those crops don't fully reach maturity. So they're the breakdown over the course of the next season is there to release those nutrients to that growing crop. It creates a really nice environment for our no-till in terms of just giving us kind of a mat to drive on. And then the next year we've got that residue out there to suppress weeds to, as we do get moisture, you know, our Achilles heel in this part of the world is typically from the 4th of July until later into August when we start to get our fall rains. So it just keeps that ground moist and provides almost a mulch between the rows. And when it works great, you can't beat it. Yeah, I got in right before I came on to hear somebody talk about failures, and there are definitely failures. Anyone that says there are not is going to give you an unrealistic expectation. But the things that we see behind these cover crops in the spring, the physical characteristics that I look for when I go out and put a spade in the soil and bring it up and see so many earthworms that I you know, they're just everywhere. And I see all of the channels that they're leaving through the soil, and I see the deep composing root system, and I see the consistency of the soil that looks like chocolate cake that, you know, is just a great environment to put a seed into and for us to get good seed to soil contact. You know, those are the things that really get me excited about what we're doing. And I just feel like we're building our soils in ways that we couldn't through the two crop system of corn and soybeans in a rotation. And in our part of the world, that requires tillage because we just can't break down that corn residue quickly enough to where, you know, you might get by with it once, maybe twice, but over time that residue would build up and cause problems with seeding and things like that. So I'm really excited about cover crops. They are just part of our plans every year. There are times when we do get knocked out of our system. The last few years have been extremely challenging, but last fall we were able to kind of get ourselves back on track, and we just are really sold on them and feel like it's a great fit for what we're trying to accomplish.
So Paul, do you, so I'm just trying to get your rotation down. You're planting wheat, you're putting a cover crop in it. You are basically stripping your fertilizer with your hog manure, and then planting your corn the following year. Do you do some that doesn't have manure? Do you do any strip till or anything with corn?
We do. So if we get a chance, we're huge proponents of banding fertility, especially ahead of a corn crop. Where we don't have access to the manure, we will go out with a commercial strip tiller. We'll put out our immobiles, our PK. We'll typically put out about 40 to 50% of the N that we think we're going to need in a stabilized form. And we will typically put that in a band about 6 to 8 inches below the row. And that works just fine as well. I mean, the first time that we did that, I thought, you know, we've established this great stand of cover crops. We're going to come in here and destroy it. And it really doesn't hurt that much at all. I would fully recommend doing the cover crops, the strip till, whatever you feel you need to do to get ready for that next year's crop. And I think the advantages are all still there.
What type of applicator are you using for your manure? Are you just having a shank with just a knife on the end, or so you're not ripping up all that cover crop?
So for the probably up until last year, so for about 12 years, we were running a Dietrich knife. It had a very narrow shank to it, about a 1/4 inch shank. And then on the base of the tool, it was like a wing that would give us a little bit of lift to the soil. So the manure would go down and then it would go lateral at about a 5-inch level, giving us a wider band. We had problems with that knife for the first time in 19 and 20 with the excess moisture. It was just too wet for that knife. And so we went to a VTI roll unit, just a rolling wavy coulter in those years. And so now we've got 2 tools that we can use that we can select from. I'm a fan of both. I do like that Dietrich unit just because of the, you know, we can put more of that manure at the 5-inch depth and then give us more of a lateral spread. Whereas with the VTI, it's more vertical on the row. But I'm a fan of both. And the VTI takes less horsepower. You can run it in more conditions. The Dietrich, I think, probably does a little better job of putting all the manure below the surface.
Okay. Is that something you built, or did you find it somewhere? A manufacturer had it?
So our local dealers carry both of those units. And so we just purchased them through a retailer, and has worked well.
Okay. What do you do on your soybeans for fertilizer? Do you fertilize the year before, so you're building when you're putting your corn fertilizer down, or are you broadcasting on that?
So on our soybeans and our wheat as well, for our PK, any nutrient needs that we have, based on soil tests, crop removal, we will be broadcasting those nutrients. If you own a strip tiller and you want to strip till in front of those beans as well, I see guys do a great job with that, and I wouldn't be afraid to do that. But I can say that we are broadcasting on both soybeans and wheat, and that's working well.
I know Brian said he didn't really ever see a yield loss doing that. Have you?
I don't feel like we have, no. No, I can't say there's been a loss ever.
Okay. And you guys are both just using planters, putting a little more down pressure on for your soybeans? You're using your same planter for corn and soybeans, assuming?
Yeah, and typically we're finding that those cornfields, if there's a problem with them, they're usually holding moisture, they're a little wet. So down pressure is not an issue. We run a good row cleaner out in front. We're running a Martin floating row cleaner. And then we have our planter set up with precision equipment. So we're running Delta downforce. So we're just monitoring that ground contact and our margins and making sure that our depth is where we want it. And we typically have no problems. I actually started a few years ago as well. Our goal has been to get soybeans planted earlier each year. It seems like there's yields increases that warrant that early planting. So we started actually planting with the air seeder if we hit a date where we wanted to go and we weren't done planting corn. So we were planting with our air seeder in 15-inch row spacing. And we find that we're able to do a good job there as well. We just run at about a 30-degree angle to the rows, and it puts them in the ground.
Nice. Do you put any fertilizer down with your planter or side dress or?
We have not. We've run a lot of tests and just can't get a lot of consistent yield response out of starters. We do have fairly high P and K levels on most of our ground. So for probably, I would say the last 5 to 6 years where margins have been extremely tight, we've gone away from it and just tried to be a low cost producer at the risk of maybe leaving a few bushels on the top end. Prices are appreciating nicely, so I won't say that we won't go back to it, but we haven't recently.
Okay.
As far as just on that, when I first started with strip tilling, my agronomist was saying that I had to put liquid on at the planter as a starter with it, and we did it for about 2 years. And I think the most I ever saw was 3 bushel, and it was about a half point drier. It was never paid for the starter. You got that in the band. Usually my knives, I slip my knives up the back a little bit farther, the drop tube, so it spreads it through that zone instead of dumping it all at the bottom. So basically you got a starter already in that strip there for the plant to get going with. So I haven't seen any yield increases with it enough to justify it.
Okay. I think you're muted, Brian.
Sorry about that. Still get confused on that. Once back and forth on that. Paul, with you said you put some flax in with your mixes. How are you managing that? In 19, I PP'd all my corn acres, and then some of my mixes had flax in it.
Yep.
And last spring I no-tilled into that, and I can tell you I'll never do that again, because that was like planting through Cecil rope out there or twine. It just wrapped up on all the bearings and stuff. And I didn't know if you managed it differently, or what your thoughts were. How do you guys handle that?
So in our mix, and I'm speaking off the top of my head, but the flax is probably less than 10%. Okay. So I don't think that we get enough residue to pose a problem. I can tell you, I can see that that could be a problem. We haven't had that problem, and it may be because of the percentage. It may also be due to the timing of our plantings, that it maybe doesn't get quite as hardened off or mature. I don't know when you planted it within the calendar year, but typically when we're planting around August 1st and we're terminating with frost, you know, after about 8 weeks, I haven't really seen a problem with it.
Okay. Yeah, when I did mine, it was in the beginning of July. So, I mean, mine actually headed out and everything. So it got full growth on it and everything. Okay. So she hardened up pretty good.
Was it part of a mix, or did you plant primarily flax?
It was part of a mix.
Okay. Yeah, and those are the things, you know, every year is different, every mix is different. So, you know, it definitely takes, kind of start with an idea and make it work for your farm for sure.
Do either of you guys graze any of your cover crops, or have anyone graze them for you, or?
That's an excellent point. I wish that I actually had cattle that I could graze on these cover crops, but I do have one of my landowners that I rent from does have a cattle herd, and I can tell you that these cover crops are such a great fit. Most years when those pastures are drying up and hardening off, he can get anywhere from 30 to 50 days of grazing off of these cover crops. Now we watch so that we don't graze them down too far. And I had to sell him on this idea and concept because he had never heard of it. And the first time he turned his cattle into these cover crops, it took him a few days to get used to them, get a taste for them. But once they did, he couldn't get them out of there. I mean, they just loved it. And they probably, in let's say a September through late October, early November scenario, put on at least a condition of body score. I mean, he was actually putting condition on them, bringing them into, you know, he'd pull the calves, throw the cows back out there, and just a phenomenal opportunity to make your feed last, to keep those cattle out on the range longer. And for me, as the guy doing the cash crop side of things, it just recycles those nutrients that much faster. You know, I love having all that ruminant manure out there. So we do it whenever we can, and that just makes the system that much better. If you've got cattle or livestock that you can graze, it's just a bonus.
You're muted now, Bruce.
You didn't, sorry, you didn't do anything different with your fertilizer or anything because of that. I know with manure, you know, you're only going to get a certain percentage of first year and the second year credits, but you didn't change your fertilizer because of that, or have you seen anything different on the fields that you graze?
We don't, but we just know it's kind of a bonus. We know it's going to be better, but we don't change. We don't reduce fertility. Over time, we've been able to increase the efficiency of, let's say, our nitrogen use on corn and some things like that. But we're always careful. The last thing we want to do is cost ourselves yield. So we reduce our applications slowly. But specifically, I won't change a fertilizer rec just because of a single grazing. And because of the way our rotations work, every 3 years.
Okay.
You know, because so but it's a fabulous thing, and I'm just a huge fan of grazing livestock. Now the trick is and my landowner agrees with me, if we are no-tillers, so if we get significant precip or if things get really muddy, we got to get them out of there.
Compaction purposes?
Yeah, compaction and just foot tracks and things like that. We can't have a bunch of divots out there, and yeah, they can really mess up the surface in terms of preparing a seed bed for the next year, or you know, having row units bounce over tracks and things like that.
I've talked to guys. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, it's got to work both ways. You know, I keep his needs in mind, and he keeps mine in mind, and it's a great deal for both of us.
I've heard of guys that have had that when it's wet that I've talked to. They've had to go out. It's gotten bad enough where they've had to go out with the VT or something in it before they plant it. It gets so dang rough, and they've had to hit it with the VT just to level it up a little bit.
Yep, it takes some management, and that's, you know, that's enough to keep some guys away from it. But I can tell you the benefits we feel make it worth it in this area.
One thing I like to mention, Paul had one of his very first things there he talked about was hiding his cover crops back behind the growth so the neighbors can't see it. I've gotten now, and I don't know, maybe Paul is now too, but after I've done this enough, I like putting it right along the highway, get everybody talking about it and thinking about it, and just so they're asking questions after a while, just to keep them guessing.
Yeah, you know, it's pretty easy now because cover crops are widely adapted in my area. So, you know, there's really, they're part of, you know, if our rotation on a normal year is 30% wheat, 40% corn, 30% beans, we're gonna have them wherever that wheat is grown. I mean, guys are just used to seeing that air seeder running right behind the combine, and so yeah, it doesn't have the reputation that it used to have. I think producers recognize it as a legitimate tool now. And grazing is something that has helped that along. The livestock component has really made some believers out of, you know, everyone's got their motivation, but that's a big piece for a lot of guys around here.
And I know I can attest to what Paul was saying. I know I was talking to him on the phone the other day, and I used to custom combine with my brother out west of Pier, out in Hayes, and you would see 50% fallow and 50% cropped, it seemed like, every year when we were out there. Me and my wife just went out on a vacation in September, and we drove through that same area, and it was wheat, corn, Milo, sunflowers. I mean, there was just everything out there. So they've changed, but then just about every field, I bet 75% of the field had a cover crop planted in it, you could see, that were wheat. So it's good to see they've adapted out there quite well. Hopefully we can do that around here. Anyone else have questions for the three presenters?
Yeah, Bruce, to Paul with the manure, since we're having the dairies right here, and from the analysis that I've heard, I haven't had any manure on my fields yet, but I'm hoping to this fall. With the analysis they're coming back with, we don't need any fertilizer going into corn the following year. So if I was going to put a cover on my beans, after I combine the beans, they come in and I would fly on a cover in August, combine the beans, they would come in and inject the manure, and they go at an angle. What kind of, would just strip tilling that in the spring and putting corn in to, you know, for the silage the following year? Is that something that they think would work?
Just to make sure that I understand and that everyone else does, are they putting the manure on the soybeans or the corn?
Injecting, they would be injecting the manure into the soybean stubble.
Okay.
Where I would potentially have the even if it's just straight rye growing, you know, have that seeded in August, combine off the beans, they would inject the manure into the bean stubble, and I would come back in with corn the following spring, potentially for silage to go back to the dairy the following year. I mean, my thought is if I could just run a strip till that spring, plant the corn, potentially be good to go. And then and then spray out the rye sometime in there, pre-planting or post-planting or something.
Would you be strip tilling just to create a seed bed for the planter, or what would be
Yes.
the?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, because I mentioned this earlier, I keep getting guys telling me that you can have potential insect problems planting corn into standing rye if you don't kill it off a couple weeks ahead of time and get that dead.
Yeah, I shared. I've heard my concern would be, and we don't do this because we don't have rye in any of our cover crops for concern over contamination with the wheat. But my concern would possibly be any ileopathic effect. You'd want to make sure and get that killed early enough before going into with the corn. And in our part of the world, we try and no-till it first. If you couldn't, I mean, I see no reason with running that strip tiller that wouldn't be a good thing. But with a good row cleaner, could you even make a strip good enough to stick that corn in there?
Well, I think I could, because I've been planting soybeans the last 2 years into standing rye, and it plants beautiful. You know,
right.
So I plant the corn easy enough. It's all the when do I get rid of the rye with the corn coming in and stuff like that?
I think that's the question right there, because Bruce and I talked a little bit. No tilling soybeans into rye. You know, we have guys that do it while the rye is knee to thigh high and green and growing, and soybeans will blow out of the ground, and they really thrive on that competition. I think corn is the opposite in that it does not compete well. Right. And so I would probably err on the side of eliminating that rye as soon as I could in the spring, just to make sure that any of those effects have maybe been negated. And then depending on if you can get that corn stuck in the ground, unless you feel like the ground's not warming up or something, and maybe you play around with it, maybe you do a little of both, but I'm going to try and just run the planter out there for starters, and maybe try it both ways and see which works the best.
Well, because I know, you know, up here, the rye that this will be my third spring coming into having some rye on the ground, usually putting beans into it, but the rye usually doesn't get greening up until the first half of April. So to plant corn in it the second half of April, the rye is pretty small yet, so it wouldn't be hard to go out and kill it.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
With the beans, I'm not planting till into May, so the rye has been in boot stage when I planted.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Yep. And the nice thing about rye too, from what I understand, is even though it looks pretty insignificant above ground, it has good root activity and is doing, things below ground. So
okay, well, that's kind of my other concern or thought was, is the rye doing anything if I'm killing it off when it's only 2-3 inches high in the spring? Is there much effect? So,
well, and kind of just a little background with what Jim's dealing with up there in a lot of Traverse County. We've got heavy clays. Water in the spring is a resource concern to us. So if we can use something that's going to grow in the spring and utilize or uptake some of that moisture, carry our equipment, things like that, that's basically why we're using it. Otherwise, we could easily go to an oats, barley, you know, something in the fall that's going to grow in the fall, but then we're not going to have that uptake of moisture in the spring. So,
in the spring.
Right, Jim, or not?
Oh, definitely. That's one of the biggest benefits I've seen with the rye planting beans. They're the driest fields I planting into that rye.
Rye
yeah,
is a
so-
water hog.
Common practice up here is you have to till it to dry it out so we can plant it. Well, where I have the rye, it's beautiful. It's dry. It's, you know, there's moisture underneath, but the surface is good.
So it sounds like the balance that you're going to be the best one to balance that out. The rye is still going to probably be better than an annual, like an oats or something.
Yep.
That will kill off because it's much more tolerant to frost. It'll grow later into the season. It will come out growing earlier in the spring.
Yep.
And you're probably going to be the best one to know when the right time is to terminate that. And every year is going to be different depending on how much moisture you're dealing with.
Right.
You know, maybe you've got too much water and you're saying, I need to let this stuff grow another week or two just to deal with this, even if it means planting my corn a little bit later. You know, those are the management decisions that you make, but at least you've got a tool out there to make a decision with.
Right. And that's like Bruce mentioned, that's kind of what we deal with is we're wet. We were wet last year. We had water
Yep.
standing all summer.
Yeah.
So up here, the rye has kind of become, some call it the poor man's tile, drain tile.
Sure.
Just because
Yep, I'm with you there.
You know.
Yes. I think you're on the right track. And I think as you look at each year and the different factors that you're dealing with, I think you're on the right track to make the right decision.
Well, and I know when you said you planted your first one out behind the trees so the neighbors didn't see it. The first year I did it, I just, behind my wheat, I put it right by the highway. And I'm like, heck with it. They're going to see what I'm doing. And it worked great. It was the best yield I had. So I part of the reason I started doing it is because everybody said it would never work. So that was enough push for me. Well, I'll try it and try to prove you wrong.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever taken with rye is such a water hog, but you know, everybody always worries about the soil temps being cooler with the cover crops and stuff. But I had that one year, I took a laser temp gun and walked out into one of my fields with the rye, and I put it on a bare spot of ground, bare black patch of ground. And as I wanted it up close to a rye rut, I gained at least 2 degrees on that temp gun. So when they say that you have to have black soil to get the warmth, that's definitely not true. Because I mean, it wasn't just in one spot. I did that in multiple spots out in the field, and that temp gun always raised at least 2 degrees every time I got it close to the rye rut.
That's good to know. I got to go out and try that this spring.
Yeah.
One thing that's difficult too, you know, soil temp is just one factor that affects our crops. You know, I've started to step back a little bit and focus more on just having a growing, living root in that soil at all times. And I think about the interaction with all the soil life that's out there. And I won't say I don't care what the soil temp is, but I'll take that living root any day over because I just feel like an active living soil is going to be so much more productive.
How long do you guys feel it took to be able to see that as far as more microbes and things, and your cover crops starting to grow better? Because I don't know, that first year it seemed like our cover crops didn't grow much. It's going to be interesting to see what happens this year. You know, we're so used to corn and soybeans that I wonder how long it takes for that microbes to know that there's something else there. Understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I've probably had more issues with it just from the conditions for growing for me, for my cover crops. The first few years I did it, I mean, I had fantastic growth. I was out combining my corn after I got it seeded, we got the rains. It was 70s and 80, pushed 80. And I mean, I had rye and that was probably close to a foot tall already by the time I did corn harvest. Now the last few years have been cooler and wetter. I'm lucky if I get a couple inches out of it, and it's straggly looking stuff. The rye definitely always seems to come through in the spring. All of a sudden it gets up, it gets going, and like everything, it's, I don't know, I get just my feel is anyway, just weather dependent. Still needs sunlight and heat to get the stuff to grow. So.
Okay. There's a couple we haven't heard any questions from yet. If you guys have any in the back of your mind, you guys know this is pretty informal, so no question is a bad one. Kevin or Jeff or anyone else have anything?
Brian, what was your strip till? Are you running coulters or a knife on that?
Knife. I got in the fall, I run a 2-inch, 2 to 2.5 inch knife on it. And then in the spring, I'll switch out and run about 1.25 inches.
Paul, I think you have strip till too. What are you running on that?
You know, we've had both. Last year, our window was so short to run, and it was such a priority for us after having missed a few falls that we ran a knife and a coulter. So we'll see. I had a soil wire that was set up with wavy coulters, and I had a John Deere with a shank on it. So I don't feel that with the shank we can place our nutrients a little bit deeper. We were probably still getting 5 to 6 inches with that soil wire and the coulter. But for me, I'll take either one of them just to get those nutrients banded and give us that strip to plant into. I don't have a strong preference one way or the other.
And you guys can tell me whether I'm blowing smoke, but the guys I've talked to with these strip till equipment, they're trying to sell them. They're basically saying they prefer a knife in the fall and they prefer coulters in the spring. I mean, is that pretty accurate, or?
I'd say that's a good generalization.
Yeah. The biggest thing is with the knife that I've seen in the fall when the ground's a little bit harder, it's easier to get that knife to suck in the ground and go. I know some guys with coulters in the fall, they'll have issues getting them to penetrate and stay on the ground. Some guys with warriors, there's a reason why they're built so heavy. They need the weight to get them shoveling, especially on headlands. I know guys will do headlands a couple of times just to try to get a decent strip built, but where usually with the knife you don't. But the knife in the spring, last spring we had really nice conditions. The knife worked well. If it's wet, you could run into issues then, because then it could get slabby and you could smear that trench too, and then you could have issues with it too. So with the wavy coulter, you'll avoid a lot of that. So a lot of it depends on your conditions too.
And possibly air pockets in the spring, I would say as well.
Yeah.
If you run it in the fall, it gives a good chance for that slot to mellow back out and settle in.
You want to definitely in the spring, you definitely want to, usually in the fall, I don't run in a basket on the back because I like to leave it a little rougher. It seems like you get less washing with it in the spring. But in the spring, then you definitely going to want to have a basket on it, try to crumble that back down and firm that strip up.
Okay. Any more questions? We're nearing our 2 hours. We can go 2.5 hours if we got questions, but as I say on everyone, I don't want to waste anyone's time. So everyone's busy, especially this time of year. So if you got questions, if not, I sure want to thank Brian and Paul and Carissa. I thought that was great engagement and a lot of knowledge that was thrown out at us today. So I want to thank you guys very much. And I'm going to ask for one more time for questions.
If anybody has any other questions after this, either contact Bruce or I set them on the Soil Health Coalition. My contact stuff's on there, or go to the Corn Growers Board. And my number and stuff's on there. If you have any questions, I'm always free to discuss, talk this stuff. Got any questions to ask, don't be afraid to give them, contact me.
And I have been recording this, so when I send that out, if it's okay with Paul, and Brian and Carissa, I'll put your contact information on the recording when I send it out. The link, we'll have a link, and we have a Traverse County Soil and Water YouTube page now that we'll put it on too. So if you want to rewatch it or have any questions or something you missed, we can take care of it then. So I want to thank everyone for attending today, and happy planting. Hopefully the spring is good. Thanks, guys.
Oh, thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having
everyone.
us.
Thanks a lot.
You bet.